Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you all. In this episode, in this unit, we're going to move forward. In our last unit, we looked at the theory of demand, and we actually considered the rule that when you put the price of something up, then what's going to happen is that the quantity demanded is going down. You want to sell as much as you can, you want to increase your sales, consider moving down the price. That's what we looked at last time. In this episode, we're going to look at another great player when it comes to prices, right, and costs and all those things, which is supply theory. Let's put that down. Remember that when it comes to producing goods and services in the market, there are two sides of the market. They are the consumers, that's those who demand, and they are the producers, which are those who supply. Last week, we looked at the position from those of the consumers. Now we're looking at the other side of the market, which is also involved when it comes to setting the price, which is the producers. The producers are those that supply us with products, those that supply us with goods, and those who supply us with services. Now, the general rule of supply is as follows: the law of supply. The law of supply is that the more you get paid for something, the more people out there are going to come along and produce it. And the more profit in the business, the more people are going to jump into that occupation and they're going to produce more. So that if the price for cars suddenly goes up, more firms are going to consider jumping into the motor industry. If the price for hot dogs or hamburgers goes up, and you're going to find more hamburger vans and more hamburger chains, right, all over towns and cities and villages and so on. If, however, suddenly people aren't, the amount of money that people are prepared to pay goes down, then people might find that less of it gets produced. Let's now illustrate this on the board. Like with demand, we're going to be using the same axes. You have your price here and the quantity there. The quantity being how many goods are supplied, and the price being how much money is going to be taken. Now let's give an example of hamburgers. Let's make hamburgers as an example. Now, let's say that this is price 1, right? We'll stick to shekels, which is what we use in this country, right? And let's say that there's about 3.5 shekels to $1. So let's say that the going rate for a hamburger is 10 shekels for a good hamburger, for a quality hamburger. 10 shekels. Right? Remember, P is price, Q is quantity. The price is how much money is taken. The quantity is how many goods are supplied. Now let's say that at P1, this amount of hamburgers is sold. Right? Let's say that it's Q1, which is Right, let's say in the city they'll sell 1,000 hamburgers a day. But if the price of hamburgers, the going rate for hamburgers goes up from 10 shekels to 20 shekels, right, you might sell twice as many. You might sell Q2. You might sell 2,000 hamburgers a day. And we'll join the line together like this. Make it straighter. Go, and we call it the supply curve. So that at P1, we're going to be selling Q2 hamburgers. And at, sorry, correction. At P1, we're going to be selling Q1 hamburgers. And at P2, we're going to be selling Q2 hamburgers like that. Beta. There you go. That'll have to do. That's the supply curve. Now, it's not just about goods that we talk about supply. That curve doesn't just exist for hamburgers. Let's look at another example where we can have a look at the supply. Imagine you as a student, right? And you're working hard, and you would also like to earn some money. And let's say that the going rate, let's do it in dollars this time, for an hour's babysitting is $5. Not many takers, are there? The supply is going to be quite low. In fact, it may not even be at P1. We might not, it might be even lower than P1, in which case, if it's over here at $10, we're not going to get any takers at all. Sorry, I'm too busy studying. But let's say it goes to $10, right? Where originally it was $5. Well, maybe somebody will be quite happy to babysit. But what happens if you push up the going rate, the going rate for babysitting from $10 to $20 an hour? Wow. Now you're talking. Oh, but you're busy this evening. For $20, you can put everything aside. So do you understand that the more money that's being offered for a good, and the more money that's being offered a service, more people are going to crawl out of the woodwork and supply it. At P1, as you can see behind me, right, at P1, we're only going to get Q1 people, and at P2, we're going to get Q2 people, which is a lot more. So we're going to get an increase in supply. So what you can see from the diagram is a direct relationship between price and quantity when we look at the supply curve. That the higher the price, the more is going to be supplied to the market. That is the simple supply function. And remember, of course, that the higher the price, the more likely businesses are going to be making what they earn to make, which is profits. And a big profit is much more attractive than a small profit. Thus, at 10 shekels a hamburger, businesses will make small profits. People thinking you're in the business say, listen, you can make bigger profits elsewhere. But when the going rate doubles and it's 20 shekels, right, for a hamburger, ooh, that's going to be a lot of profit. And all of a sudden, out of the woodwork, you're going to be seeing all over the town, right, people producing hamburgers. So do you understand? The greater the reward, the greater the supply, and that people are just going to turn up and they're going to start somehow or other producing this particular product, this particular good, or this particular service. And it is a direct relationship. Put up the price, you're going to get more supply. Good, that's the first principle. Now look at the second principle, which is what might make that curve move. If there's an increase in the price, we're going to use the same curve. Because if there's an increase in the price here from P1 to P2, from P1 to P2, all we have is a movement along the curve. But there are other conditions that can affect supply that might mean that for the same price, more is going to be supplied, or at the same time, same price, less is going to be supplied. Okay? Now, a change in price, moving a thing up from P1 to P2 or P2 down to P1, right, is called a price determinant of supply. Right? This, going towards the bottom, is a price but something that causes the curve to move is what we would call a non-price determinant of supply. And we're going to examine this now. Let's put the heading non-price determinant of supply, which means that for the same price, either more is going to be supplied or less is going to be supplied. Remember that when we looked at the demand function, we had price determinants of demand and non-price determinants of demand. Now for supply, we have exactly the same price determinants of supply and non-price determinants of supply. And for the rest of this unit, we're going to have a look at the family of what possible things are non-price determinants of supply. Now, let's have a look at the first one. Let's go to hamburgers. Right? What would happen if the price of hamburgers, the meat for the hamburgers, went up? The price of beef has gone up. If the price of beef is gone up, whether you're going to take P1 or whether you're going to take P2, you're not going to be wanting to supply so much hamburgers. You know why? Because money that will be going into your pocket is instead, as profit, is instead being spent on the higher price of beef. So therefore, what would happen would be that the supply curve would shift to the left. S1. You get the idea? Which would mean that we have a much smaller, we have a much smaller quantity of hamburgers being supplied at P1, and also a much smaller quantity of hamburgers being supplied at P2. You get the idea? If, however, you would get the reverse factor, a reverse thing would be that the price of that there might be a fall in the price of beef. It could be, for example, far too much beef has been produced, and there's a general fall in the price of beef. In that case, instead of the curve shifting to the left from S to S1, we're going to have the curve shifting from the right from S to S2. And so on. See what's happening? But for P2, the price going for hamburgers is P2, and the meat's cheaper, then that's going to increase the profits that people are going to be making. Because at P2, having to spend less on the factors of production, which is your land, your labor, and your capital, any fall in any of these prices means that it's going to be cheaper for the production of this particular good. More profit is made, and therefore you're going to get more production of the good. So our first non-price determinant of supply is costs of factors of production change. Right? There's been a change in the cost of either land or labor or capital, in our example, the meat, right? Any of those, right, change either becomes more expensive or less expensive then what's going to happen is there's going to be a change in the supply. There's going to be a shift of the curve. So that, for example, if the original curve is S, well, what happens is that the factors of production are more expensive, less is going to be supplied. Therefore, there is a shift of the supply curve to the left. If, however, there's going to be a fall in the cost of the factors of production, then there's going to be a shift of the supply curve to the right. Now, cost of factors of production is probably one of the, if not the, most important non-price determinant of supply that causes a shift of the curve to the left or to the right rather than a shift along the curve. However, there are others, and we will consider the others, right, a little bit more briefly. What the others might be. One thing might let's look at them one by one. One could be, another one could be change Another one could be changing technology. Let's give an example. Computers. They've come down in price over the years. Laptop computers. 20 years ago they existed and they were prohibitively expensive. Today, they're far cheaper, and it can make sense to be able to tell students in school that part of your school equipment is your own personal laptop computer. They've come down in price because the technology is much better and they can be produced far more cheaply, and that has caused the supply curve to move from S to S2 for computers. See? Same type of supply curve, whether we're talking about hamburgers, whether we're talking about computers. Now, there are other factors that will actually also, apart from technology, for example, what happens if you get an increase in supply of, let's say, fish? There are loads of fish that are being caught. Fish has become a lot cheaper. Right? Fish, there's a big surplus of fish. That's only also going to cause more people, probably at a cheaper price, right, to be motivated to be able to use chips more cheaply. That's another example. Okay, so what can happen is that it can sometimes be affected by another good or service. Now, to give one or two more drastic examples, right, which I'm going to make as number 3, because we 4 or 5 should do fine. A supply shock. A supply shock is when all of a sudden the conditions of supply change. Let's give an example. Let's say we're dealing with coffee. And what happens is that Brazil, which is one of the main coffee producers in the world, is suddenly hit with a particularly bad crop. Now that means that the amount of coffee produced is going to be a lot less. Right? And that means that there's going to be a supply shock. It's going to move from S to S1. Another example, right, of another factor that can actually move it. What happens if the government starts putting taxes on things? If a government starts taxing either a good or a service, then what's going to happen is it's going to become more expensive to produce. Let's say, for example, the government starts taxing fast food. Now, if it's taxing fast food, because it's going to say, well, it's a luxury good. You can surely make your own food, and the government's short of money. It needs to finance the hospitals. It needs to finance the schools. Let's put a tax on fast food. Right? Tackle overeating at the same time. It's going to move from S to S1, which means that the price of fast food, right, it's going to cost a lot more to supply. And of course, the fast food suppliers will try to pass the tax on to the consumers. But it will cost more because the tax will be placed on the producers of every portion of fast food. On the other hand, the government might say like this: it's COVID. Let's make life a bit more pleasant for other people. Let's reduce the tax on fast food or abolish it. You know what the producers are going to say? Yippee, we're going to produce more fast food and we can do it at a lower price. So therefore the supply curve will move from S to S2. Or the government might do one thing further. A government might decide that instead of putting a tax, right, before was a tax, which would shift the curve to the left, they're going to put the opposite to a tax. They're actually going to give money to encourage producers to produce fast food. That is called a subsidy. A subsidy will cause the supply curve to move down to the right again, which means that more can be produced at that particular price. Now, that really summarizes it. So that really brings us to the end of the lesson, which was the end of the presentation, which was a shorter one than usual, because a lot of the similar ideas in supply are with demand. Same as in demand. A price determinant will cause a shift along the curve. A non-price determinant will show a shift off the curve. The supply relationship is that you put up the price or put up the rewards given to the producers. More producers will come out of the woodwork and produce that particular good or that particular service. That's rule number one. Rule number two is that if there is an outside change, a non-determinant, for example, there's a change in the cost of the factors of production, right? Either if it costs more to produce, it's going to move the supply curve to the left, and if it's going to cost less to produce, it's going to move the supply curve to the right. If the supply curve goes to the left, less will be produced. If the supply curve at that price, if the supply curve goes to the right, more will be produced at that price. Same as the P1, same principle of P1. Okay? Now, just to finish, other non-price determinants of supply, which are outside the control of the supplier, it's a non-price determinant. It's a change in technology. Technology becomes better, things are more, you like to get more produced. Similarly, if there's a sudden supply shock, that the things that you suddenly relied on, or whatever it is, are no longer there, and it's much more expensive to produce it, all of a sudden, out of the blue. A COVID is an example of a supply shock, because we've got fewer people at work than there used to be, and we've got a problem producing the necessary goods and services. You're likely to find supply moving to the left. Similarly, taxes. The government might want to try to think, this is a luxury good. We need money. Let's put taxes on the luxury good. Non-price determinant moves it to the left. Or they might say, we like the fact that people are producing these goods. It'll be very good for our relations with the public. Let's help people to produce these goods. For example, an example of something that might be subsidized might be the production of essential food like bread, milk, and other things, or healthy food, that the public will appreciate. So in that case, if they subsidize the food, right, then it will go from S to S2. Okay, we're going to be coming back to these topics. In our next session, we're going to be combining what we've done in demand theory together with what we're going to be doing what we've done today in supply theory, and bring the whole picture together, right? And to see how the invisible Adam Smith's hand works in setting prices and why prices tend to change and go up and down. We're also going to be revisiting in future units the issues of when the governments put taxes and to what effect, and when the governments put subsidies with what effect. What needs to be noted at this stage, though, is that when it's only producers and consumers, we are dealing with a perfect market. Nobody's interfering with prices. Nobody's interfering with conditions. But when we're dealing with the government putting its nose in or getting itself involved, however you want to express it, into supply and demand, by either encouraging demand or discouraging demand, or encouraging supply by, for example, with taxes, or with subsidies, or discouraging supply, e.g. with taxes, we no longer have a perfect market. These are things that we're going, when we look at the more complex, imperfect markets, are going to be dealt with future sessions in microeconomics. Okay, well that completes our talk on supply theory. I hope you enjoy it. And then on with the good work. Next one will be all about price. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.